people say Wisconsin's a 50-50 state, they're not talking necessarily income.
No, they're talking property.
Meaning assets?
Meaning assets and debt.
How are we talking about need when it comes to maintenance?
The court's supposed to weigh two competing principles when they talk about maintenance. Need to the receiving spouse and fairness to the paying spouse. And the intent is supposed to be, if the receiving spouse has a need for maintenance, it's because they're not able to maintain the standard of living that they had during the marriage.
Hi, everybody. I am Holly Mullin. I am the managing partner at Sterling Law Offices, and I have with me today attorney Austin Miller. Austin, how are you?
Hi, Holly. I'm doing great. How are you today?
I'm great. Austin is a colleague of mine. He's a partner at Sterling Law Offices and a close friend. So we are lucky to have him here. Austin is going to help us understand maintenance in Wisconsin. And now even just the term maintenance might confuse people, like we're having some sort of like home improvement show. Tell us what we mean. What are we talking about when we say maintenance with regard to family law?
It's not home repair or renovations because I don't know how to wield a hammer or a screwdriver or anything. So I am not the appropriate guest for that topic. Maintenance, though, in Wisconsin, it's also known in other states as alimony, spousal support. It's money that one spouse has to pay another as part of the divorce or legal separation.
And that's different than other money that might be paid by a spouse, like, for example, child support?
Yep, maintenance is different than child support. In Wisconsin, just very high level, we calculate child support first, then we look at tax implications to both parties, and then we look to see if there's still a big enough gap and a bunch of other things that we'll talk about. But we look if there's a big enough gap to see if there's still a need for some additional support above and beyond that child support.
You might have maintenance where there's a case with actually no children. Whereas, like, of course, you couldn't have child support with no children, but you could have maintenance with no children?
You can, yes.
How do courts or how do people like decide if a case is appropriate to have a maintenance order?
Yeah, so Holly, you and I skyrocketed to internet fame when we talked about child support on a previous episode of this podcast. So let's, that child support calculation in Wisconsin is very formulaic. You plug in certain factors and it's gonna spit out a number. This is what child support should be. We do not have anything like that in Wisconsin when it comes to maintenance. So the main factors the court looks at, they have to refer back to statute. And there are, 10, 12 different factors that they look at in terms of maintenance. The biggest one's going to be how long have the parties been married? How's their health? And what are each earning? Is there a gap in between incomes?
So those are the primary ones. And then there's a slew of other ones that you would consider maybe less pertinent.
Yeah, so they're still relevant in many cases, but they're a little more niche or a little less common. But the starting point the courts usually take are, all right, how long have you been married? And what do you each earn?
So when you say how long have you been married, are we saying shorter length marriages are probably less likely to have a maintenance component?
Yeah, there's no hard and fast rule in Wisconsin. The statute doesn't say if you've only been married for 5 years, you're not entitled to maintenance. In practice, that's probably it's not an incorrect thing to say, but there's no rule, hard and fast rule there. But as a general rule of thumb, kind of a starting point that we look at is if you've been married over 10 years, maybe we look at a maintenance obligation for up to half the length of the marriage. If you've been married over 20 years, starts to get a little muddier. Is this going to be a forever obligation? If you're over 30 or 40 years, yeah, they're probably just going to make sure you each have the exact same access to money down to the penny for the rest of your lives. But not always. We can't ever say it's going to.
It sounds pretty great. I mean, it sounds a little like, whereas with the child support conversation that you and I had on a different episode, you were able to kind of very clearly black and white define this calculation and the factors. This seems much more subjective.
It's subjective. It's important to know who's who's going to make the decision, right? If you're in front of a certain judge or a certain court commissioner, It's important to get to know kind of how they personally feel about maintenance, because they have so much what we call discretion. They can hear arguments from both sides, and based upon what they feel is fair in a given situation, they can really do whatever they would like, as long as they take into consideration, the factors that we talked about, and the others under the statute. So it's a really big gray area.
And is the court looking to make everybody exactly equal? Like, what if we have a divorce where, you know, husband makes $65,000 a year and wife makes $75,000 a year?
Yeah, that in that situation, again, if I just knew that, and let's say they'd been married 15 years, I'd say probably not a maintenance case, right? You both have about the same amount of income. There's not, even if ordered, there's, after we factor in taxes, there's really not that big of gap. Now, if one party's significantly older than the other, if there's health issues, if there are other, if someone put the other party through medical school, maybe there's some nuances there, but in general, that's not a big enough gap. And in almost all cases, except the most really long-term marriages, the courts are going to want to incentivize the higher earning spouse to keep earning or earn even more. So they're going to want to see more of the share of the income be with the higher earning spouse than the lower earning spouse.
So there's not a rule, a hard and fast rule that, look, at the end of the divorce, each party has to have the exact same amount of cash flow or disposable income.
No, and it's a little, in practice, I think there's a case law out there that says the starting point is the court should look at what a 50-50 division of income might be. But in practice, that's not really what
That's not
happens.
often. Okay. So when people say Wisconsin's a 50-50 state, they're not talking necessarily income,
No, they're talking property,
meaning assets.
meaning assets and debt.
All right. Great. That's good to know. Now, let's say there is maintenance. Let's say that husband has to pay wife $1,000 a month. That's 12,000 a year. Who's paying taxes on that?
Under current law, and probably forever, the paid. So husband in that scenario is paying the taxes on that.
So wife's getting that 12 grand a year free and clear. She's not claiming that on her taxes?
She's not claiming it on her taxes anywhere.
And husband doesn't get a write-off?
He does not. Used to, but not anymore. And I think they did that to be consistent with how they treat child support as taxable income. Or sorry, as they treat maintenance now the same way they treat child support, where the spouse earning the money pays all of the taxes associated with that. The spouse receiving the money doesn't pay the taxes on anything they receive.
So it sounds like we used to let the tax burden kind of shift down to the lower earner, and now the higher earner gets to pay that higher tax rate. It's kind of a win for Uncle Sam, if you ask me. I digress. All right. So with this situation, we have support being paid. Is that, how does it end? Can it end? Can it change? Like, what are the terms that go along with that?
Yeah, every maintenance order should say how much it's going to be, or how much the payment is going to be per month, and when it's going to end. The end might not be clearly defined. It might be tied to the remarriage of the receiving spouse. It might be tied to the death of either spouse. Or it could be very clearly defined by saying spouse A will pay spouse B maintenance $1,000 a month for 10 years, right? And or however long it might have a defined endpoint. The modifications to that are really contingent upon what type of order that is entered. Is this a clearly defined amount for a clearly defined period of time? Maybe a little bit harder to get the court to modify. Go talk to a family law attorney. If it's more open-ended, maybe the court's just looking at, okay, has something major changed that makes the current order either unfair to one of the spouses?
Got it. Now, you said if the recipient gets remarried, does that mean for sure maintenance will end when that happens? Like, if the wife in the example I gave, who's getting $1,000 a month, she gets remarried, does does that cue her ex-husband that it's like, now I'm done, I don't have to keep paying her?
In general, yes, there's an obligation for the spouse that's getting married to notify the other, so they can move to terminate. But it usually terminates as of the date of marriage.
So what if wife decides to just live with her new boyfriend and not get married?
Not an automatic termination. There, we would need to look at it. It's a common question though, because who wants to be paying support for a spouse living with a new partner? But it's not automatic in Wisconsin. The important thing is does that living situation, cohabitating with a new spouse or a new partner, change their financial situation? Does it decrease their need for the spousal support? So, no, while not automatic, we could look at, are they paying less now now that they're spreading costs between two people? Does that free up more, or does that reduce their need for spousal support? Those are tricky cases to prove and prosecute, but it's something the courts can look at.
Mm-hmm. You used a word that triggered a question for me. You said if they may need it. So when you say need, are we looking at like, well, I want to buy this house, or I have to like pay for a car and you don't have to pay for a car? Like how are we talking about need when it comes to maintenance?
Yeah, so I guess we could have touched on this a little bit earlier. The court's supposed to weigh two competing principles when they talk about maintenance: need to the receiving spouse and fairness to the paying spouse, right? Need and fairness. And the intent is supposed to be if the receiving spouse has a need for maintenance, it's because they're not able to maintain the standard of living that they had during the marriage. That's broad. There's nuances all over the place, but that's in broad terms what that looks like. So if spouse B needs X amount from spouse A to not see a dramatic change in their lifestyle, but now they're cohabitating and they're getting some of that need satisfied by sharing expenses with a new partner, then maybe there's a cause to reduce spouse A's maintenance obligation. And you'll notice I say maybe, and I couch it in all these terms because it's going to be really hard to pin down any attorney on this issue because it's so gray and so much comes into play.
I mean, it sure sounds that way. It's sort of like, well, these factors may apply. And if you are entitled to maintenance, then the question is how much and for how long, and it might terminate in these circumstances.
Yeah.
So this is very enlightening to hear all of these nuances and how a court might apply. But I would assume if you want certainty on this issue, the best way to accomplish it is reaching an agreement and not leaving it up to a court in the first place.
Absolutely. We always want to do that. And even something as simple as the idea is to keep the standard of living. That's impossible in 99% of the cases. So even though we have this idea that that's what we want maintenance to do, separating into two separate households, doubling those living expenses, unless you're very high income earners, that's just not going to be possible for either spouse. So even though that's the intent and the goal and the hope we have, I have so many clients come to me and say, well, I need this to maintain my standard of living. And I have to say, well, no one is going to maintain their standard of living here. And it's sad, but we do the best we can to figure out a fair resolution.
Life is changing for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, very helpful. I so appreciate your time and expertise, Austin. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, as always.
Understanding maintenance is just part of the battle, but how you actually file for divorce, that decision can shape everything that follows. Make sure that you are set up for success. So check out our next video on how to file for a divorce.